Today, we welcome to the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series Professor Kerry Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is Chair and Advisor, Academic Development at the Education University of Hong Kong and a Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Johannesburg. His research focuses on curriculum policy and theory with a particular interest in citizenship education. He is currently editor-in-chief of Discover Education Springer and was formerly editor of Curriculum Perspectives. Professor Kennedy serves as editor of several academic series, including Routledge Schools and Schooling in Asia, Asia-Europe Education Dialogue, and Perspectives on Education in Africa, as well as Springer Civic and Citizenship Education in the 21st Century. He is also co-editor of Springer's Governance and Citizenship in Asia series. In 2024, he co-edited the Routledge International Handbook of Life and Values Education in Asia. His forthcoming book, Disruptions and Civic Education, How Should Young People Be Prepared for an Uncertain Future, will be published by Springer in June 2025. So, Kerry, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here.
Excellent. So you have a really diverse and rich background in terms of academic research, teaching experience, and so forth. And the first question really all my international guests would get at the beginning of the conversation is quite straightforward and challenging at the same time. And the question is, what is global citizenship education? And considering that myself and many other colleagues discuss global citizenship from critical and ethical perspectives, how do you see global citizenship education within the current geopolitical context?
Well, that's a big question, and let me try to address it. I think if you'd asked me this question 12 months ago, I would have a different answer.
Hmm.
I think that the geopolitical context or contexts really have fundamentally altered what we think about in terms of citizenship.
Absolutely.
My view has always been that global citizenship education in its modern form emerged along with the globalization zeitgeist, along with the view that we should all work together. This is a view that really only dominated since the Second World War. And while it has those neoliberal beginnings, of course, the work of people such as yourself, Emiliano, but many others, also trod along the line of critical democracy. And I think therein lies the importance of global citizenship education. But today, we live in a world where things like trading policy, which probably is not something many of us as educators think about very much, but in terms of its underlying theoretical framework, although I'm sure this is not something Donald Trump thinks about very much, but indeed, it goes way back into the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and is often just called mercantilism. That is, it's really important for nation states to get as much money as they can. That's a simple definition of mercantilism. And therefore, I think probably in this century, if we took some time to go back, it is this view of the nation state that is now dominant. It is this view that says it's national interests that are important. It's the view that says America first. But it's not only America. The Chinese dream of Xi Jinping, for example, is underpinned by the same kind of mercantilist thinking. It's the nation state that's important. So, in terms of global citizenship education, I think I would say two things. It's probably more important now than it was, and it's also more difficult than it was. So that in the United States, for example, aspects of global citizenship education have been banned in schools. Talk of equality, talk of equity, divisive concepts in many, many states in the United States are no longer able to be taught. I mean, they are banned from schools in the United States. So I think it's that difficult side of global citizenship education that we now need to come to grips with. We don't have an overarching macro context which says it's really better to be together. I always remember the Hillary Clinton election campaign, stronger together. Well, no, it's not stronger together anymore. It's every person for themselves. And I think that's the challenge for global citizenship education, is to work out how now to make itself relevant in a whole new macro political and geopolitical context that does not favor working together, partnerships, equality and equity, are no longer on the agenda of many countries. So how do we work in that context? That's the question I now ask about global citizenship education.
Absolutely. And this feeling of individualism, extreme individualism, partially pushed forward by the neoliberal agenda, as you mentioned, but also mostly became part of our way of being, perhaps because we are constantly bombarded by the social media campaigns and the superficiality of the news that we get on a daily basis, to the point that it really gets difficult to even read a couple of pages from a book, just to contextualize the speed of our daily lives nowadays. So we have that. We have this change in the geopolitical context, and we have also perhaps a direct attack to the way of thinking about higher education and education as a whole. What do you think about this?
Well, I think, again, if we use the United States as an example, we do see direct attacks on universities, not because they've done anything wrong, but because they don't support the current America First agenda. But we even find that in the United Kingdom, for example, that the funding of universities has become really quite difficult.
Yeah.
And while the democratic ideas in the United Kingdom are still very much in place, the extent to which higher education is valued is now quite different, I think. It's seen in quite a different light. So again, it's reevaluating how to work with that, uh, how to work with a context where universities are seen largely to be linked to the economic agenda of countries rather than an agenda which seeks to find out what is good, what is right, what will help most people. How can universities work in that humanitarian context, if you like, rather than the economic context? So I think it's the worst examples are in the United States, but they're not the only examples of where universities in particular are coming under extraordinary pressure to conform to whatever the system wants them to be, rather than what historically they have been.
Yeah, and within this context, how do you believe that a platform, at least as I conceive it, and perhaps yourself too, and certainly other colleagues conceive it as an ethical platform, a dialogic platform to really put back on the table discussions about the purposes of education in general. How do you see the role of a global citizenship education that is potentially at least critically and ethically oriented within this super complexity that you just described? And later, I want to ask you also a couple of questions about your book, but let's begin with this question. I believe, is challenging enough for a first part of this
Yeah,
conversation.
I think this is an important question. Yeah, the question is, where do we want the impact of our work to be? We can continue to work together. We can continue to write. So far, there are journals which will publish everything that we want to say. But are these the people who need to hear what we want to say? That is, how do we influence policy? How do we influence politicians? How do we get the message to those to whom the message may not be so appealing?
Yeah.
So I see it at two levels. Yeah, we can continue to talk, and that's good. We continue to go to conferences, we can continue to write, but that's not going to change anything. And I
Mm.
think citizenship and citizenship education in particular ought to be about change. What are we going to change? Who are we going to change? And how are we going to do it? I think these are the big issues.
Yeah. Agency. I believe this is a core element that you are introducing here. So, how would you then take this platform, global citizenship education, which by definition puts together three big notions, global citizenship education indeed? How would you advance a type of global citizenship education that takes it to the policymakers and the people in power, if we can call them so, in a way that potentially at least, theoretically at least, shapes their minds towards a type of society that is not only GDP and economic based, but also values based, ethically oriented, and potentially fostering a type of leadership that is more interested in the common good.
Well, I think there are a couple of ways. One is to remember the value of education and how it is that we educate about citizenship. On the one hand, there's a lot of work on citizenship about action, about getting things done, about being an active citizen. But I think that's important. But we also got to think about the knowledgeable citizen. What do we want young people to know? For example, in the United States, presidents, probably the last three presidents, have been elected with less than 50% of the vote. So voting is actually very important. Many citizenship education people put it down all the time. No, it's not about those institutions. It's about taking action in the community. It's about getting things done in the community. It's about agency, so that students feel good about whether or not they can bring about change. But in fact, in a democratic society, we bring about change when we vote. Now, there's a lot packed into that, and we don't want to have a debate about voting, I'm sure. But I do think that our education programs need to prepare people to engage in the most significant ways. But voting is not the least of those.
Mm.
That would be my argument. The second and related part of that is that we have to adopt the view that citizenship education doesn't stop when school stops. I think we need a much more concerted program of citizenship education post school so that citizens are constantly informed, they are constantly led to new ideas and new thinking. And we don't just leave it to social media, we don't just leave it to normal media, we don't just leave it to peer pressure. We actually go into the community and help and support the community to understand what it is that's going on. Let me venture into a really controversial area.
Let's do it.
If you look at the current situation in Los Angeles, anyone would have told President Trump that the people in Los Angeles are the most supportive of undocumented people. And therefore, to do what he's doing in terms of making the situation even worse uh, is in the end something that's going to come back, and I think to him personally will have great ramifications. But the people in Los Angeles do know that they have some capacity to resist. And while I wouldn't be supportive of resistance without knowledge, that's the way I put it. You got to know what it is that you're resisting. If that knowledge has come either from experience or from community values or individual values, then you can see why it is like it is and why bullies like President Trump will constantly fight against it because he doesn't understand the force of it. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance of education, particularly education in the community and of the community.
Absolutely. Educating for voting and the power of the local community. Indeed, I believe one of the merits of this discussion on global citizenship and global citizenship education, at least as I frame it and other colleagues would frame it, is one of the merits is exactly that it brings back the connection between the local and the global. Now I want to move on with your recent book, Disruptions and Civic Education. How should young people be prepared for an uncertain future? Which called my attention because it's exactly the type of theme that fits the current geopolitical and socio-political context. What are two or three themes from the book? And also another couple of questions I'd like to ask related to this very interesting book is the difference between civic and citizenship education, since you're using civic education in this specific book, and then what type of uncertain futures?
Okay, well, this book started with an idea uh, because so many people use the phrase disruption.
Yeah.
And very often it's used in the economic sense of the term. It's kind of the Elon Musk view that move quickly and break things. And when you look at that historically, you find that's exactly what disruption means in terms of the economy and in terms of capitalism in particular. That capitalism only works because it keeps breaking things. It keeps changing, it keeps veering one direction and the next direction. But my understanding was, while that's important, is that we were currently experiencing other disruptions, many other disruptions, the geopolitical disruptions, for example, which aren't always called disruptions, but fit the pattern of move quickly and break everything. Or if you look at things like climate issues, for example, fundamentally geopolitical disruptions uh, about which there's huge differences within communities. So what I tried to do in this book is to put together everything that I thought was a disruption,
Yeah.
in addition to the economic disruptions. That is, I wanted to, if you like, multiply the understandings of what disruptions meant. That was the first point. And the second, and perhaps more important point, was to say these don't happen one after the other, they all happen together. So the economic disruptions keep coming, and we see that through artificial intelligence and the predictions of the World Economic Forum, constant job losses, et cetera, et cetera. We see demonstrated the geopolitical issues every day, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Africa with Darfur. We see it all the time. And sometimes all those things happen in the one place to some people together. So that was the rationale for the book. What I tried to do was to show in the subsequent chapters that there are some issues that we really need to deal with. For example, if there's going to be continuing banning of books from schools, if people are going to say, no, teachers can teach this but not that, that undermines the processes that will help to overcome the disruptions. If, for example, people believe that climate change is not real, it's just a construction, that is really highly problematic in terms of equipping young people for the future. So what I do is to take each disruption and try to say, well, if there is a contrary view, we need to understand that that view will lead itself to even further disruption. So if you don't do anything about climate change, it will become worse and worse and worse. If you don't do anything about racism, it will become worse and worse and worse. Uh, so I tried by using examples in the current environment, whether they were examples around equity, around discrimination, around the banning of information and ideas, and to say all of these things don't help us to overcome the disruptions. And I then, perhaps unwisely, but I came up with a model, if you like. It's not really a model, but a way of thinking about a life and values education, which may be one way to equip people to both understand the disruptions and to be able to deal with them. So it's a very personal book. Um, I'm fortunately at a stage in my life and career where I can do exactly what I like, and no one tells me how or what to do. So it really is a personal exploration of what I think are issues that are
An
affecting
example of
everyone.
academic freedom.
Indeed. And don't forget, I live in Hong Kong.
Exactly. Yeah, so I mean, you were mentioning that this is a book bringing in perspectives that are quite personal. The second part of my question was related to the difference between civic education and citizenship education, and why in this specific book project you are using the definition civic education.
Let me give you two answers.
Excellent.
Let me give you the classic answer, which is that civic education deals with the structures and functions of government, and
Hmm.
citizenship education deals with the ways citizens engage and act in the communities of which they're a part.
Hmm.
Now, that's a definition. What's not revealed there is that my own background in terms of both engaging with, learning about civic education was in the United States at Stanford University in the late 1970s. And I had a supervisor and mentor, Professor Richard Gross, who only ever talked about civic education. So
Right.
every seminar was about civic education. And I actually kept saying to him, but Professor Gross, because I never called him by his first name. He was a professor, right? Professor Gross.
Formally.
In Australia, there's no such thing as civic education. So why am I doing these courses? And he would say, that's, well, you're not in Australia now, you're in the United States, so you have to do these courses. When I went back to Australia, um, uh, once I'd finished my degree, what started to happen was a resurrection, I use that term cautiously, of civic education by Paul Keating's government in the 1990s. And so suddenly I realized that everything I'd done at Stanford was actually quite relevant. And I was wedded then, perhaps forcefully at first, to the idea of civic education. I personally see it as much broader because I think it focuses on the community, on the civicus, if you like. Um, but I realize that people will ask exactly the question, why civic and not citizenship? education.
Hmm.
So my book series is actually called Civic and Citizenship Education. So
Exactly.
that
Let's embrace both. That's probably the best.
that
Always
satisfies
the
everyone. But
holistic way.
my personal experience simply makes me talk about civic education. And then we can have
Yeah.
this conversation, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to ask you a question related to your forthcoming projects. I know that you're very active, you're a very dynamic public intellectual, and we worked together for some of your series too in the past with great pleasure. Forthcoming projects, what is on the table at the moment that you are prepared to share with our audience, or any team idea that you particularly interested in and you like to develop moving forward?
Well, let me talk about two things, and the first may seem a little strange. We have in Hong Kong a requirement that all students in universities, and indeed all students in schools, must study national security education. This is not a well-known term. It is used elsewhere and means different things. What national security education is largely civic education in the traditional sense of the term. It is about the structure and functions of the Hong Kong government, of the Chinese government, of the way those two things are related. But there's a hesitancy to talk about it. So I was very fortunate to be asked by a colleague to join in a project that would ask students in universities what their views were of national security education. And my purpose in joining that was to try to normalize the use of the term, to highlight it as one aspect of the way in which citizens are educated, that it's not abnormal. In fact, it's probably maybe a little bit too normal. And so we were able to talk with students in 11 universities in Hong Kong and get their feedback and try to understand where they were coming from. So that's one area, and we're just writing some papers on that now, um, and trying to both to understand the results, where students were quite frank about what they experienced and what they wanted to experience. So that's
For
one.
example,
Well, the thing that stood out mostly was pedagogy.
mm,
Um, they want a more active, engaged pedagogy. They want um, they want more discussion and less lecturing.
mm,
They want more content about Hong Kong and less content about the actual nature of national security laws in Hong Kong. Um, we have many students in Hong Kong from mainland China, and they represented 20% of our sample. And those students want to know more about Hong Kong. And some of
interesting.
them said in interviews, what we know about Hong Kong from our previous education is not what we experience. We experience a different Hong Kong. So we want to know more about the local because we already know about the national because they've had all kinds of national education in China. We find that when we ask students questions like, well, do you understand China better now? Mainland students say, yes, 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 of course we do. And on our survey, score very highly. We ask Hong Kong students and they say, well, yeah, kind of. And they score much lower than mainland students. So we think we've got some interesting results. We've got some interesting theoretical frameworks that we want to use around our data. But mostly, from my point of view at least, we just want to encourage discussion in the community. We want to say,
Yeah.
you can talk about this. This is not problematic in any way. it's a subject for open discussion.
Yeah.
The second project is one I'm involved with some younger colleagues on higher education leadership. But the extra of that is we want to know how leaders engage with diversity, equity, and inclusion in their universities. What do they mean by it? What policies do they follow? And do they do more than the legal requirements that might come from governments in terms of laws about diversity, equity, and inclusion? So we've been doing that now for about 18 months, almost 2 years, trying to understand how at multiple levels within the university, from the teaching staff through to president. What do you know about diversity, equity, inclusion? What do you do about it? And we've also want to know how students feel about do they have a sense of belonging to the institution? We now have students, as I said, from mainland China. We have international students. We have local students. Within our local student population, we have Chinese-born students and we have ethnic minority students. And do they feel in the same way? So we will finish this probably towards the end of next year. But we think it's what we're seeing is quite interesting and important in terms of the values in a higher education institution and how those values play out in an operational way. So they're the main two things that I'm currently involved in. And the diversity, equity, and inclusion, which of course is an important part of global citizenship, is assuming much more importance than probably it was in the past.
Absolutely.
To some extent because of what's happening in the United States, but also because Asia is not well known for its policies around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, particularly in Japan. I'm not sure about
Well,
them.
Well, yeah, in multiple Asian countries, it is similar. In Korea,
Yeah.
for example, you have very strong pro-government policies actually
Hmm.
related to DI because a lot of people are coming back, a lot of people are marrying locals.
Yeah.
But the response within the community is very negative in Korea.
Mm.
Very negative indeed. So that's another area we want to explore as well,
Yeah.
because that's one of the things that I'm most interested in is how the context, however you define the context, influences attitudes to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Interesting. In connection to this, I want to ask you a final question based on this very interesting conversation we are having today. How would you define global citizenship education in three keywords and why the three keywords?
Well, I think the first word I would use is partnership. It may not seem like a very strong word, but I think this is something that's radically missing in the current environment. That whether it's about climate change, whether it's about DI policies, whether it's about ways in which we support those people in our communities who need that support more than others. Uh, if we have a really strong view of partnership, we may understand that. But I
Yeah.
guess to strengthen a little, my second word would be equity. I
Okay,
think
equity.
equity is perhaps the one thing that demonstrates how important partnerships are, so that if a community is able to say, well, yeah, there are some people in our community who need our support, and we are happy to give them that support. To me, that's what equity is about. It's about fairness. And then thirdly, of course, equality. I think sometimes equality and equity are mixed up, but I
Yeah.
think uh, we can't discard equality, but I think equality is moderated by equity. So as I'm sure everyone who's listening is aware, you can have an equal society in which there's no equity.
Mm.
Which people think it's an equal society, but there may not be any equity in that society. So I think if I had to choose, yes, three words, they're the three words I would choose, with the middle word, equity being the strongest
Equity
word.
at the center, at the
Yes,
center. All
yes, I think
right.
so.
Very interesting conversation. Thank you, Professor Kerry Kennedy, Chair and Advisor Academic Development at the Education University of Hong Kong, a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, and a prolific writer, editor on the topic of civic and citizenship education and beyond, I should say. Thank you very much for joining the Global Citizenship Education interview series.
Thank you very much for having me, and I've enjoyed the conversation very much.